Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
I don't believe in God. I believe in science.
Today's interview is with Casey Luskin on the topic of intelligent design. Also, we want to point you to the link in the show notes to our podcast feedback survey so you can be entered to win an apologetics book of your choice. It will take you 90 seconds, but will give us helpful feedback to make the podcast better for you. Thank you. Chad, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing really well. I'm excited to interview Casey Luskin. I've been reading his work and listening to him for probably over 10 years. So I, in some respects, feel like I know him, but I was telling a friend of mine the other day that if somebody said, if I was in this bizarre scenario where somebody said, you have to pick somebody to debate the topic of intelligent design, to debate the merits of intelligent design. And if they win, you get to live. And if they lose, you have to die. Who would you pick? I have to say that the first person that popped in my head was Casey Luskin.
Well, he has done plenty of work on intelligent design. Let's look at his bio here. He's a scientist and an attorney with graduate degrees in science and law, giving him expertise in both the scientific and legal dimensions of the debate over evolution. He holds a PhD in geology from the University of Johannesburg, where he specialized in paleomagnetism and the early plate tectonic history of South Africa. He earned a law degree from the University of San Diego, where he focused on First Amendment law, education law, and environmental law. His bachelor's and master's degree in earth sciences are from the University of California, San Diego, where he studied evolution extensively at the graduate and undergraduate levels and conducted geological research at Scripps Institution for Oceanography. Dr. Luskin has been a California licensed attorney since 2005, practicing primarily in the area of evolution education in public schools and defending academic freedom for scientists who face discrimination because of their support for intelligent design. In his role at Discovery Institute, Dr. Luskin works as Associate Director of the Science for Center and Culture, where he helps direct the ID 3.0 research program and assists and defends scientists, educators, and students who seek to freely study, research, and teach about the scientific debate over Darwinian evolution and ID. So you can also check out our previous interview with Casey Luskin, which we will link in the show notes, but I'm excited to have him with us today. Let's go to the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Casey Luskin, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be with you guys.
Yeah, we just both want to publicly say we appreciate all the work you've been doing. Over 15 years, we've been listening to your stuff, reading your materials, and I think you're like the go-to person that we would want to talk to about intelligent design and everything surrounding that. So thanks for your work, first of all.
Well, I appreciate that. It's very kind of you. And I remember doing an interview with you guys a few years back, and it was a great interview, and I really enjoyed it. So I appreciate what you guys do, too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back. Can you tell our listeners a bit about your background and how you got interested in intelligent design?
Sure. So this will take us back a little bit to the late 1990s when I was an undergraduate student at UC San Diego, University of California, San Diego. I was studying earth sciences, and even before I declared my major, I was taking all kinds of courses in evolution. I mean, pretty much throughout my undergrad years, every time I had an elective course, I would try to make it focused on some kind of an evolution topic most of the time. And so in the course of that, I started to realize, okay, this evolution view, there's a lot of evidence for it, but I'd like to also understand other views. And so during the summer after my freshman year of college, I had an internship. And during the lunch break every day at that summer internship, I read a book that a friend had recommended to me called Darwin's Black Box. Mm-hmm. And that was my first real introduction to intelligent design. And what I realized while I was reading Darwin's Black Box was that sort of these ideas that I'd had while sitting in these evolution courses that, okay, we have all these complex features in life, but how do you evolve them in a stepwise evolutionary pathway so that they stay functional and natural selection is preserving and favoring each step along that pathway? How can you do that when you have these complex features? It kind of seems like you would hit places where there might be non-functional intermediates or deleterious stages, or at least steps where you require a lot of new functionality, new components to be present before you get some new advantage. And in my brain at that time, I hadn't really fully articulated a lot of this. And when I read Darwin's Black Box, it was like Michael Behe has put into words exactly what my freshman undergraduate brain was like trying to figure out. Like it made so much sense. And so from there, it just went downhill. I started reading more intelligent design books. I mean, there were books by William Dembski at that time, some stuff by Philip Johnson. I read, also towards the end of my undergraduate years, I read Icons of Evolution by Jonathan Wells and a number of other books that are sort of maybe not quite so well known, and really just got interested in the topic. And so at the end of my junior year of college, Philip Johnson was actually brought to come speak at UC San Diego. Through that, I decided to host some post-lecture discussion groups. And I volunteered to do this, and they were going really well. And we invited all kinds of people to come to these post-lecture discussion groups, undergrads, grad students, even some faculty members. We had atheists and Christians and other people of other faiths and everything in between. We just had a really wonderful time talking about these issues. And what I realized in these discussion groups we were having was that we were having conversations that so often me and my friends in my classes wanted to have about origins. We were actually able to ask hard questions and to challenge evolutionary ideas, whereas in our classes, that was almost never allowed to happen. I mean, the vast majority of the time, it was you just sort of take notes and accept the evolutionary view. And I was not ever the kind of student who would rock the boat in class anyway. I was usually just the kind of kid who would take notes, pay attention, and I wasn't there to give the teacher a hard time. But nonetheless, these opportunities to have these conversations were really not happening. And so out of these Philip Johnson lecture discussion groups, we decided to start a student club called the Intelligent Design and Evolution Awareness, or IDEA Club for short. And the IDEA Club really was a great success at UC San Diego. Again, we had all kinds of folks coming of all different beliefs and backgrounds. We were all very committed to having a civil, friendly, and just kind and very amiable discussion with each other. No matter what your background was, everybody was welcome to come and share their views. And we really had some very fruitful conversations. We would invite evolutionary biology professors sometimes to come and present their ideas at the club, and had a great time doing this. And all folks of all different backgrounds are welcome. And so anyway, when I then graduated from UC San Diego, some club members and I decided to start a nonprofit to help other students to discuss these topics and start idea clubs on their own university campuses. And that was the Idea Center, which still exists to this day. Mm-hmm. So anyways, that was how I first got interested in intelligent design. It was basically as an undergraduate student wanting to have the opportunity to explore this scientific debate over evolution, Darwinian evolution, and intelligent design, but not having the opportunity to do that in my classes. So me and some friends created a venue where we could do that. And that was the Idea Club. And from that, I got involved with the intelligent design issue.
Tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing right now with the Discovery Institute and that sort of thing. Sure.
So my background at Discovery is that I first started working there actually in 2005. And from 2005 to 2010, I was primarily had a job that was mostly involved with sort of legal or public education policy type work, where I would advise teachers and educators and school board members and state legislators how to teach the issue in public schools without getting into legal trouble, and teaching evolution objectively, essentially, in public schools, and also providing a lot of academic freedom support for scientists who are being persecuted because of their views on intelligent design. In 2011, I had sort of a job shift where I was more doing science-related work, helping just sort of to started to get involved with managing some of the research that we do at Discovery Institute, the research that we fund, and making sure that people have the resources they need to do their research, some of the research projects that we're funding. Then in 2015, I left Discovery for about 4.5 years and moved to South Africa, actually, where I did a PhD in geology at the University of Johannesburg, and came back from South Africa at the sort of beginning of the pandemic in 2020. My wife and I were told by the U.S. State Department that we needed to leave South Africa immediately, or we might not be able to get home. They could not promise us that the borders were going to stay open. Nobody knew what was going to happen at that point. So they said, you better get home. So we did that. And thankfully, when I came back to Discovery in 2020, we kind of came back unexpectedly, and it was quite shocking the way it all went down. We came back, we didn't have a car, we didn't have cell phones. We were not expecting to be home in the US so soon, and going through a lot of what I guess now I know is reverse culture shock. I didn't know it at the time. Yeah. But when we came back, I had no job. I had nothing going on. So I sort of remained in contact with my friends at Discovery Institute. And I said, well, look, I don't even have a way to pay my mortgage right now. Is there any chance there's a position for me? And thankfully, John West and Steve Meyer were very kind enough to offer me a position. And I was rehired as Associate Director of the Center for Science and Culture at Discovery Institute. So the work I do now is not entirely different from some of the work I did in the past. I still work with teachers and school board members and educators on how to teach the issue objectively and teaching evolution accurately in public schools. I still provide, academic freedom defense for scientists who are being discriminated against because of their views on evolution and intelligent design. But what I think is dominating most of my time these days, and has really been an exciting thing to see grow so much during the years that I was gone from Discovery, is I get to do a lot of managing research. We have something called the ID 3.0 research program at Discovery Institute. And I can tell you a little bit of the background on this. The year before I left Discovery in 2015, John West and Steve Meyer knew that there was some new funding to fund some new research projects. We'd funded research projects before then, but we knew that we had some opportunities to fund new research. And they asked me to come up with a list of about 50 potential research projects within intelligent design that could be funded and done by folks in the ID research community. And so that was pretty easy actually to come up with 50. We'd been talking about these ideas for a long time. These ideas were in the air. But what I started to do is I started to crowdsource ideas for ID research and just started contacting many of the scientists in the ID community, asking them, hey, if you had a research project that you could do inspired by intelligent design, testing intelligent design, maybe using intelligent design as a guide or heuristic to do research, what would you do? So crowdsourcing this, the ideas just started flowing. And in the end, I handed to Steve Meyer and John West sort of one of my parting gifts before I left Discovery at the end of 2015, a 100-something page prospectus for a research program with over 225 ideas for ID research projects. And
wow.
I titled this prospectus ID 3.0. And that was where the name then came from. So what kind of happened was I gave them, all these ideas, and they weren't all mine. I mean, again, I crowdsourced this, and I made it clear, this person gave us this idea, and that person gave us this idea. A lot of great ideas when you just start pestering the dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of scientists in the ID movement, and asking them, what would you like to do with research? So while I was gone then, they made the ID 3.0 research program a reality. So far, we've only been able to fund about 20 to 30 projects, but still, that's a great start. I mean, that's a big research program to be funding 20 to 30 projects. And so I kind of felt like when I came back to Discovery in 2020, I kind of felt like, okay, this is like I gave birth to this child, this ID 3.0 research program, and then I abandoned it for about 4.5, 5 years. And then I came back and this child is now, slightly grown up and I'm supposed to raise it now. And I was like learning about how well these projects had succeeded during the 4.5, 5 years that I was gone. It was really exciting to do that, you guys. And I still enjoy getting to manage our research program. And it's funny, for a long time, and we can talk about this more, but ID critics have sort of just been in denial about the fact that there is ID research. And I understand, a lot of these points are debatable. Folks don't always agree with intelligent design. They can agree, they can disagree with the conclusions. That's fine. I have no problem with any of that. But, the question of whether or not Discovery Institute is funding real research and there's real papers being published in peer-reviewed journals, these are sort of black and white questions that should not be denied. I mean, if you want to have a serious conversation about intelligent design, let's at least agree on the nature of reality. And the nature of reality is that Discovery Institute and others in the ID community are funding real ID research, and that research is being published in peer-reviewed papers. You may not like that fact, but there's a lot of facts about reality that we don't always like, and we need to acknowledge them when they are reality.
Yeah.
Hear, hear.
You guys like that fact, but some of our, and I could cite some critics, who have made some interesting comments along these lines. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, first of all, I remember when you left, and I remember reading about it on evolutionnews.org, which is a great website that I recommend to our listeners. And I remember thinking, he can't leave. He can't leave. And then when I read that you were coming back, that you were going to co-edit a book with Bill Dembski and Joseph Holden, I was super excited. But before we go any further in the discussion, I know this seems rather elementary, but I was wondering if for listeners, you could just tell them, what do we mean when we say intelligent design? And the reason I thought it was important to start kind of with that question is because even in your recent discussion on unbelievable with Adam Shapiro. Even he brought up the fact that the term is sometimes used inappropriately by people on both sides of the aisle. And so when you're talking about intelligent design, what do you mean by that?
No, I appreciate that. It's really important to define our terms and explain what we're talking about here. And not everybody is familiar with intelligent design. So I would say that within the ID movement, there is pretty strong consensus about what intelligent design is. And I think pretty much everybody I know within the ID movement would agree that intelligent design is a scientific theory which holds that many aspects of life and the universe are best explained by an intelligent cause rather than an undirected cause, say, like natural selection. And so how do we detect design, or what does this mean? Well, intelligent design is based upon our observations that when intelligent agents act, they create certain types of information. And the kind of information which is produced when intelligent agents act is what we call complex and specified information. Okay, so what do we mean when we say complex and specified information? Well, roughly speaking, something is complex if it is unlikely. And so we could say that, for example, I use this example a lot. The sound waves that are coming out of my mouth right now represent a very unlikely pattern of vibrations in air molecules. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was designed. I mean, we could have unlikely vibrations in sound that are coming from, dropping a bucket of golf balls on the floor, or rain falling on the roof of a tin roof of a house. You're going to get a lot of unlikely patterns of vibrations from that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's some kind of designed pattern going on there. So what do we do to actually detect design is we look for an unlikely scenario that also matches some independent pattern. And when we find that matching independent pattern, we say that it is specified. So the unlikely patterns of sound vibrations coming out of my mouth right now are not just unlikely, they're also specified because they conform to the sounds of the English language. And anybody who recognizes, the English language hopefully can tell that these words were designed. And so this is how we detect design, by looking for complex and specified information. And we can use it. There's a variety of ways that we can test biological or natural systems for high levels of complex and specified information. But the bottom line is that when we're doing this, we are finding in nature the kind of information and complexity, which in our experience comes only from an intelligent agent. And so this is a positive argument for design, where we're based upon finding what we know from experience are the predictable products of intelligent action. And so when we find these in nature, we are scientifically justified in inferring that intelligent agency was involved in producing this CSI-rich system. So, just to really, really keep it very basic right now, what do we see in biology? Well, the very basis of life is a language-based code in our DNA, where the sequences of the nucleotide bases in our DNA is very unlikely. There's no physical or chemical law that dictates the ordering of the nucleotide bases. And yet they match the exact patterns that are needed to produce functional proteins. So we have an unlikely arrangement of these nucleotide bases in our DNA that is specified to match the patterns that produce functional proteins. So right there you have high levels of complex and specified information in our DNA. And it's really encoded in a biochemical language. And I like to use the example of a DVD and a DVD player to explain what's going on with the information in our DNA and cells. If you just have a DVD on its own, it's really not good for anything, right? Maybe you can play Frisbee with it or something. I used to do that in college. There were eucalyptus trees next to our dorm, and we'd take those old AOL installation CDs that they'd give away on campus and throw them into the eucalyptus bark, and they would stick. That probably wasn't the most environmentally friendly thing to do. But if you just have a DVD or a CD, there's really not much you can do with them. What you need is some kind of machinery to read the information on the DVD and then process that information, convert it to a useful output. Well, the same exact thing is going on in our cells. If you just have the information in the DNA, it's really not good for anything. Our cells require molecular machines like the ribosome or RNA polymerase or DNA, all these different machines that can help to transcribe and then translate and process the information in DNA into some kind of a useful output. Okay, so if you don't have the machinery to basically process the information in the DNA, then you're not going to be able to use it. And so this is why people have compared the information in DNA to a computer program. I think this is sort of a very close, direct paraphrase of what Bill Gates said. And I don't know that he's an ID proponent, but he observed that DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any that we've ever created. So that's a very astute observation that we literally see in our DNA, something like computer programming. commands and codes that are interpreted by machinery in the cell to give you some useful output. And then what is that output? What is the product of the information processing in our cells? Well, our cells are literally producing machines. We have machines making machines in our cells, okay? And so these machines are running around performing many of the important functions in our cells, like producing proteins, waste disposal, transportation, helping the cell to replicate, serving as sort of a CPU to process the information in the DNA, disposing of things you don't want, recycling. All these molecular machines are producing features and functions that a cell needs to survive. And so what it comes down to is, what do we see in life? Okay, we see a language-based code that is rich in complex and specified information in our DNA that then is converted through a system of computer-like information processing, where we have machines that are reading the information and basically interpreting commands and codes in our DNA and then giving you an output. And the output of that process is machine-like structures that are performing all of these features and functions in our cells. So where in our experience does high CSI language-based code come from? Or where in our experience does computer-like information processing come from? Or where in our experience do machines and machine-type structures come from? In all of our experience, these things come only from intelligence. So we have, again, a positive argument for design based upon our experience-based knowledge of what happens when intelligent agents operate and what they can produce. And I think it's a very compelling argument for design in life.
Yes.
Wow.
But the thing that I find fascinating is, as you're talking about encoded information, something needs to encode it and something needs to decode it. But those machines that encode and decode themselves have been built through the product of the same system. So where did the original information come from?
Literally, we have recursion within life. We have systems that help to produce themselves, basically. Causal circularity is what we call it. And you made a great point, Brian. It's basically, for those who are familiar with the term irreducible complexity, it's a viciously massive, irreducibly complex system where a huge number of parts are necessary for the system to be able to function, to perform what we call homeostasis, where cells are able to maintain their internal order. That does not happen by accident. It is not enough to just get, the lucky RNA or DNA strand. You need an entire suite and factory, city-like subsystems of factories that can keep this system going. And it's a lot of complexity. And if it's not all there, it doesn't work. So how are you going to evolve it by sort of an unguided step-by-step process? I don't know. And I don't know anybody who has the answer either.
Yeah.
Part of me is even frustrated that I have to bring it up, but because of the continual confusions that I see, again, it came up in your discussion with Adam Shapiro that sometimes the term ID is misused and misunderstood. One of the things is that when individuals speak of creationism and ID, they almost use them interchangeably, or they use them as if they're the same thing. So, for example, skeptic Michael Shermer, I've actually heard him call intelligent design creationism. So I'm curious as to, how is creationism and ID different? And is ID simply creation, kind of a creationism Trojan horse?
So you're certainly right, Chad, that there is commonly confusion between ID and creationism. Sometimes it is deliberate confusion to try to perpetuate misconceptions about intelligent design. Sometimes it is honest and unintended confusion from people who are just not familiar with the issue. And so we can sort of address both, I think, with one answer. So why is intelligent design not creationism? Well, first off, creationism always begins with some kind of a religious presupposition or a religious text or some kind of a religious argument. And it typically then leads you to belief or trying to make an argument for the existence of some kind of a divine, supernatural God, okay? And typically when we hear creationism, we associate it with sort of the young Earth creationist view, the idea that, the best way to interpret Genesis is that the Earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old, and we have that particular way of interpreting Genesis, and that is, the way they try to then go and find science that supports that. So ID takes a very different approach. First off, ID is not committed to young Earth creationism. In fact, many ID proponents accept an old age of the Earth, myself being one of them. That being said, really intelligent design is not about the age of things. It's about whether things were designed. And so we do have folks in our research communities. Many of them are old Earthers, but we have young Earthers too. And they all agree that the evidence points to living systems and systems elsewhere in nature as having been designed. So it's really something where, whatever you think the age is, as long as you think that there's evidence for design, then you can get along with intelligent design arguments. And so it's not a theory about the age of the earth, so to speak. Now, as far as the other sort of broader definition of creationism, something that always starts with a religious presupposition or starting with some religious text and then trying to make an argument that goes sort of into religious questions like, is there a divine creator? What is the identity of the designer? Creationism always does those things, but intelligent design does not. Intelligent design tries to keep the conversation on a scientific level. And so intelligent design has no scientific presuppositions. In the argument that I made for intelligent design just a couple minutes ago, I didn't start off with quoting any religious scripture or saying, if we assume that there's a divine creator. No, I didn't say anything like that. What I said is that we start by observing what intelligent agents do when they produce things and what kind of information they generate. And we observe that intelligent agents, this is from our observation of the world around us, intelligent agents produce high levels of complex and specified information. We can then that's an observation. We can then make a testable prediction or a hypothesis that we will find high CSI in nature. And we can then experimentally test for high CSI through genetic knockout experiments or mutational sensitivity tests or theoretical calculations. We can experimentally and computationally detect high CSI in natural systems. And so when we find it, we are then justified in concluding that design is the best explanation, because in our experience, only intelligent agents can produce high levels of complex and specified information, or CSI. That argument right there is a scientific argument. It requires no religious presuppositions. And so that's why we have within the ID movement people of such a wide variety of beliefs and backgrounds. I mean, the ID movement is not just a bunch of Christians sitting around saying kumbaya to each other. We've got Jews in the movement. Some very close trusted colleagues that I work with are from a Jewish religious background. We have folks from Muslim backgrounds in the ID community. Some of my researchers that I love to talk to and get their brilliant insights come from a Muslim religious background. We even have agnostics, or we have people from Hindu and Eastern religious backgrounds in the ID movement. So how can all these people agree on something if they don't share the same religious beliefs? And the answer is their views on intelligent design are not being driven or shaped by their religious beliefs. Their views on intelligent design are being driven by the data. And of course, people in the ID movement are very open about their own religious backgrounds. I mean, I try to make it a point whenever I speak to whether it's a religious audience or a secular audience or whatever it might be, to say that I'm a Christian. I mean, I believe that the God of the Bible is the designer. And nobody in the ID movement, whether they're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, agnostic, whatever they're coming from, nobody tries to hide their own personal religious or non-religious views. You can find complete openness from people on these questions. But we make it clear that, look, I mean, my personal view that the God of the Bible is the designer, it's not a direct conclusion from intelligent design. I mean, certainly the idea that there's design in nature is very epistemically friendly to belief in a creator God, which I believe for reasons aside from intelligent design. It certainly is very supportive of that, but it's not requiring you to have a particular religious belief about the identity of the designer. For example, the DNA, the information in my DNA, it might be screaming out there was an intelligent cause that made it, but that information doesn't say made by Yahweh or made by Allah or made by Yoda or made by Buddha or made by whoever you think the designer may be. It's just an information-rich, language-based code that points to a need for an intelligent cause, but it doesn't say who that intelligent cause is. So intelligent design does not start with religious presuppositions, and it tries to limit its claims to what we can learn through the scientific evidence. Of course, there might be larger implications from those scientific conclusions that we make, and those are fine to talk about too, but intelligent design tries to keep, as a science, it tries to keep the conversation on a scientific level. Creationism, on the other hand, is always starting with a religious text, usually the book of Genesis, and it's always trying to go into religious conclusions like, who is the designer? What is the designer's plan for salvation? Of course, those are very important questions to ask as a Christian. I think those are very, very important questions. Intelligent design just does not address them. But that being said, does that mean intelligent design is useless for those of us who are Christians? And, no, absolutely not. I mean, if you want to help someone see that there is scientific evidence that, basically this unguided evolutionary story is not true, that there is evidence for a designer who made life in the universe, then intelligent design is exactly the tool you want for that job. if you want to take someone all the way to Christ on the cross, well, intelligent design is not going to get you that far. I'm sorry. It's just, that's not what it is. It's a scientific theory that tells us that there is evidence for design in nature, that an intelligent cause is responsible for many things that we see in the world around us. And that's a very powerful argument. It can be very compelling to speak to folks who maybe are coming from a more skeptical background and speaking the language of science that they will listen to, and help them to understand that there is evidence for a designer. But, I'm not going to say that intelligent design answers every important question out there. Of course it doesn't. Some people see that as a weakness. I see that as a strength. It's simply an argument for an intelligent cause in nature. And by keeping it on that scientific level, you can speak to your scientifically minded friends with intelligent design. And if they want to go further and ask bigger questions, then there's other arguments you can bring in from philosophy and theology and history and prophecy to help them understand, okay, now you've agreed that there's evidence for an intelligent designer. Now let's ask, who is that designer? Well, you can address that question through arguments that are outside of intelligent design, but intelligent design is a very useful tool to help people see the evidence for a designer.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think anyone claiming, especially since ID has become, such a more discussed topic, I think anybody claiming that creationism and intelligent design are the same thing are either disingenuous or misinformed. I agree completely. And one of the things I love about intelligent design is exactly what you're saying, that it gets us to a designer. There's design. So who that designer is, I almost feel like it puts science in its place in a good way, because it says, look, science can only tell us so much. And if you want to go beyond design, then that's what those other disciplines are for, especially when we have so many people that almost are acting nowadays as if science can give us all knowledge, right?
Sure.
So I really find that attractive about intelligent design.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are very important things that we can know that science is not going to be able to answer. Now, that being said, intelligent design, I believe it is a science, and I believe that it gives us answers to other important questions within science.
Yeah.
Casey, I wonder if maybe you could give me a few examples of testable predictions that intelligent design can offer. And the reason I ask that is because some people would object to ID and just hand wave it by saying, well, it's not true science because it's not making predictions and it's not testable. So how would you challenge that? Can you give us some examples of testable predictions and things of that nature?
There are so many ways we can make testable predictions from intelligent design. I think one of my favorite ones has to do with finding function for junk DNA. When I first got involved with this debate in the late 90s and early 2000s, we would be talking about intelligent design, and skeptics or critics would say, well, what about all that DNA in our cells that doesn't do anything? This was basically in the early days of our understanding of genomics. Some of it was even before the Human Genome Project was published, but even after the Human Genome Project was published, people knew that only about maybe 2 to 3% of our DNA actually encodes proteins. So what is the other 97, 98% doing? Well, evolutionary biologists, by and large, just assumed that 97, 98% is junk DNA. It's not doing anything. And so we would get hit with arguments constantly from people. Why is 90% of our DNA basically useless genetic junk? Even from some of folks in the theistic evolution community who reject intelligent design, like Francis Collins. Francis Collins, in his 2006 book, The Language of God, said that 45% of our genome is quote unquote flotsam and jetsam. And of course, flotsam and jetsam is basically trash floating in the ocean. I mean, that's the definition of it. So he's saying 45% of our genome is trash. I mean, and Francis Collins is of course a Christian, but he's a thoroughgoing evolutionist as well, as far as the way he believes that life has developed. And so basically we have the strong claim from evolutionary biology that huge percentages, if not the vast majority of our genome, is useless genetic junk. Well, ID has always predicted otherwise. Going back to some of ID's earliest days in the early to mid 1990s, there are ID theorists on the record having predicted that we would find function for junk DNA. William Dembski comes to mind in an article he wrote, I think it was in the 98. And another ID proponent named Forrest Mims wrote a letter to the journal Science predicting function for junk DNA in the early to mid 90s. So why did ID predict this? Well, in our experience, again, we have to always go back to first principles to understand why ID makes prediction. We understand the way intelligent agents operate. We observe intelligent agents. We understand what do they do when they design things. And then we use those observations to make testable predictions or hypotheses about what we'll find. Well, when intelligent agents make things, they typically do things for a reason. Usually there is a purpose for the reason that something is there. And if you find a part on a system and you don't know what it does, and you know that system, you think that system was designed, well, you should probably assume that that part has a function. Maybe you haven't discovered it yet. Maybe that function is difficult for us to understand. Maybe it's only used occasionally, or maybe it was used in the past and it's fallen out of use. But regardless, we should not assume that those parts have no function. So what ID proponents have done is they have predicted that we would find function for this junk DNA. And for a long time, you guys, that evidence for function for junk DNA was sort of unknown. I mean, in the early 2000s, we would say, look, there's so much we do not know about the genome. Let's take a wait and see approach and not assume that just because we don't know what it does, that therefore it does nothing. And I think that wait and see approach that ID advocated in its early days to non-coding DNA or junk DNA was really a very wise approach, because I would say since maybe the beginning of the 2010s, we've seen an explosion of papers. Well, actually, even going into the 2000s as well, we've seen an explosion of scientific papers that have found function for what used to be called junk DNA. I mean, if I could tell you the number of papers that say, non-coding, you hear this kind of stuff all the time. Non-coding DNA used to be considered genetic junk, but we now know that it performs important functions. I mean, you can Google that phrase and you'll find hits in press releases from mainstream universities talking about their research. And it's true. It used to be called junk DNA, and there are now quite a few people that are saying, no, we should not call it junk DNA anymore. And that, to me, that's really striking. And so what are some of the functions for junk DNA? Well, primarily what junk DNA is doing is, if you think of building a house, you have the bricks, you have the parts, you have the boards and the nails and the brick and the mortar. The proteins encode the parts, okay? But something else has to provide the blueprint. Where do you put the parts? How many parts do you put there? When do you build the parts? What do you do with the parts once you have them? A lot of that is being controlled by the non-coding DNA that basically regulates gene expression. And so the quote-unquote junk DNA is now known to have highly important functions. There was an article that came out in the journal Nature about a year ago in February of 2021, and it showed the number of known functions for non-coding DNA sequences that we found over time. And literally, it was a chart that had an exponential curve, okay? I mean, the number of sequences we found that have function for junk DNA is just off the charts. And so I'm trying to find what it said, but that I'll have to see if I can find it later. But basically, that article had the same line like this, non-coding DNA, what we used to call junk, something along those lines. So I would say that junk DNA is really going out of favor. In fact, in the last year, there was an article that said that basically we should get rid of the term junk DNA, and it's sort of become a passé term. So I think this is a very good prediction of intelligent design that has turned out to be a valid prediction. And if we had gone with evolutionary biology's prediction that junk DNA has no function, then we would never have taken the time to study it. It's really people who were bucking the trend within evolutionary biology who found these functions for non-coding junk DNA. Okay, so that's one prediction. What's another prediction? Well, of course, we talked earlier about predicting high levels of complex and specified information in biology. That's an obvious prediction that intelligent design makes. It's very testable. Douglas Axe, I talked about this in the Adam Shapiro debate. Douglas Axe has done research looking for high levels of complex and specified information in our DNA. And what he did is he took the beta-lactamase enzyme in E. coli, which is an enzyme that helps these bacteria to break down antibiotic drugs. And what he did is he found that the likelihood of producing a functional beta-lactamase enzyme by chance is basically somewhere around 1 in 10 to the 77th power. Basically 1 in 10 to the 77th sequences will yield a functional protein that can perform this kind of a function, okay? And so that right there is high CSI. You have a very unlikely sequence that precisely matches what is needed to produce the functions we see in nature. And Doug Axe has done other research. It's funny. After the Adam Shapiro debate, there was a whole bunch of conversation on the YouTube post for that debate where people were talking about, what is intelligent design research saying? And a well-known evolutionary biologist who runs the channel Creation Myths, Dan Cardinale, I think is how you say his name. He made a comment saying, ID research, he says, quote, has not advanced past where it was in 2004, 2005. Where's the research program? Where are the papers? Well, I mean, I had described the research program during the debate.
That's what I was just thinking.
I had quoted names of papers where our research program has published papers. And of course, Doug Axe's research was in 2004 and 2005. That is true. But you know what? There's been a lot of research, and I discussed this in the debate, a lot of research that has been post 2004, 2005. In fact, that was just the very beginning, Doug Axe's research. Doug Axe, along with Ann Gager, did research in the Biologic Institute from 2010 to 2015, looking at the ability to convert a particular enzyme into a very closely related enzyme. Performs a different function, but they're very closely similar enzymes. According to evolutionary science, they're so similar, you should be able to easily convert one of these enzymes to perform the function of the other because they're so similar. And according to evolution, it's very easy to sort of take an enzyme and co-opt it to perform an entirely new function. And given how closely related these two enzymes were, this should be a very easy task for Darwinian evolution to accomplish according to sort of standard evolutionary thinking. So they started mutating this enzyme. It was called cable. They started mutating this enzyme and they tried to get it to convert the function of a very close genetic relative called BioF. And what they found is that it would take at least a minimum of 7 mutations in order to convert this enzyme to produce the function of BioF. This is sort of a direct test of the idea that you can easily co-opt a protein to perform a very similar and closely related function. And so this 7 mutation number is important because a previous research paper by Doug Axe, a population genetics paper, had found that if there's any trait that requires more than 6 mutations before providing any function, then according to the mathematics of population genetics, if there's any trait that requires more than 6 mutations before providing any advantage, I should say, then that trait is very unlikely to arise given the known constraints of population sizes, mutation rates, and the timelines in the history of life. And so this is basically the simple converting of one protein into a similar protein would require more mutations than could be accomplished in the history of life. So they went on in further research that they published to look at other members of this family of proteins called the GABA aminotransferase family. And they did similar experiments and found that basically this evolutionary conversion was going, if it were to take place, it would take more time than is available in the history of life on Earth. Okay, so this is all research that took place really, I would say from like the late 2000s through 2015. It's been published. It's real intelligence design research. It's post 2004, 2005. So maybe folks might disagree with this research. And if so, that's fine. We can talk about it. Maybe there's some areas where these research projects could be improved. There's always room to talk about those things. But people shouldn't be just denying that this research existed. And the very fact that folks cannot even admit the existence of ID research, that says a lot about whether they're really, I think, approaching this in an objective way. We haven't even started to talk about the ID 3.0 research that's gone on in the last, 5, 6, 7 years at Discovery Institute. This is all what I would have called ID 2.0 research. And so there's other newer research that's gone on. So that's another testable prediction that we will find high CSI in biological systems. And a lot of the research of Doug Axe has really, I'd say, confirmed this prediction. It's important to point out that these predictions were made before the research was done. These are not retrodictions where we were like, finding a conclusion and saying, oh yeah, well, we can explain that or we predicted that. I think that's a valid way to do science. Science often works by you do come up with a model to explain pre-existing data. There's nothing wrong with that at all. And I think that you can make in a way, you can make predictions as long as they flow naturally out of the model. But these are not that kind of a prediction. These are true chronological predictions where we made the predictions prior to the research being done. Anyway, I mean, there's other predictions that intelligence design makes, but I think these are two of my favorite. We can keep talking about this if you want. It's up to you guys. I've got other predictions. So
thanks for that, Casey. Maybe piggybacking on that idea of what predictions has ID made. I wonder, what do you think in the past 10 years? Because what do you think have been the major strides forward in ID theory in the past 10 years? You mentioned the different new research that's going on, but what do you think looks most promising that you might be able to share?
Well, yeah, I think that there have been a lot of major strides, but one of the most exciting things is just seeing how many peer-reviewed articles that our camp is publishing. I think a few years ago, we hit our 100th peer-reviewed scientific paper, and many of these papers have been published in mainstream journals. So to me, that's really exciting. We're talking about journals like the Journal of Theoretical Biology, PLOS One, Quarterly Review of Biology, Annual Review of Genetics, Journal of Bacteriology, and many, many others. I mean, I'm just giving you a very, very scratch the surface kind of review of this. To me, that's very exciting just to see how many papers ID is publishing in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. Again, the other big, I think, stride is just the growth of our research programs. So maybe I could take you through sort of what ID 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0 mean, at least the way I would frame it, and that'll help explain what ID 3.0 is doing. So the way I would sort of frame the three stages of ID research is ID 1.0 is sort of where we initially generated the basic theories of design detection by detecting information, concepts like irreducible complexity from Michael Behe, specified complexity, and the explanatory filter from William Dembski, and sort of some very early ID works. I would say that was probably from about the mid-'80s to 1999. ID 2.0 was like from 2000 to 2014. And this second phase involved attempts to experimentally apply some of the predictions and hypotheses of ID 1.0 to real-world systems. So we're looking for complex and specified information in biological systems. We're testing irreducible complexity. We're asking whether co-option can take place to explain how irreducibly complex systems can arise. There's about 70 or so peer-reviewed pro-ID publications that are published during this time period of ID 2.0, which I would say was from around 2000 to 2014. Well, now we're in ID 3.0. And ID 3.0 is a new phase of ID research that's really trying to use intelligent design as a paradigm or a heuristic to guide ID research, to show that there are many systems where ID thinking can be applied. And this phase of ID research is being used to answer questions in fields like epigenetics, or molecular biology, or phylogenetics, or paleontology, or genomics and genetics and looking at junk DNA. There's so many new fields right now that ID is being, I think, applied in, that is sort of the new frontier of intelligent design research, is that we're trying to see how we're finding evidence for design, but we're also saying, look, the evidence for design is pretty compelling. So what if we use intelligent design as a guide to do research? How can ID sort of help us to serve as a guide in the research that we're doing? So we talked about, finding high CSI. We talked about finding junk DNA. We can also use ID in systematics, sort of studying the relationships between organisms, where ID predicts the existence of similarities between widely different types of organisms, what evolutionary biologists often call convergent evolution. But ID argues that we don't necessarily have to rely upon sort of descent with modifications to explain the similarities between organisms. We might be able to explain it through common design. And that's sort of a possible way of understanding convergent evolution. Paleontology. ID is encouraging scientists to understand, well, what happens when we have large infusions of new information into the biosphere? How will that show up? And I think that many of the explosions that we see in the history of life flow out of a very natural prediction of intelligent design that information will be infused into the biosphere abruptly. Systems biology is a burgeoning field of biology that encourages biologists to see systems as being designed from a top-down basis in a coordinated fashion, rather than sort of like kludges that were cobbled together haphazardly from the bottom up. And when you see biological systems as interdependent and coherent and dependent upon one another, that gives you a huge new view of biology and a way to try to test the way biological systems works. And I think that systems biology, a lot of the folks in that field are not necessarily ID proponents, but many of us in the ID research community, some of which are using systems biology, think that it's very consistent with intelligent design. We could go down the list. Physics and cosmology. Not all the research for intelligent design is from within biology. Some of it comes from from physics and cosmology. And in these fields, ID encourages scientists to investigate and discover new instances of fine-tuning of the laws of physics and the properties of our universe that you allow for advanced forms of life like us to exist. So ID is certainly, I think, inspiring good science in a variety of different fields. An example of fine-tuning is Guillermo Gonzalez, who is an ID-friendly astronomer. He came up with the idea of the galactic habitable zone with a couple other scientists, but he was very much a part of developing that idea. Basically, the idea that there are only certain pockets of area or space within the galaxy where advanced forms of life to exist. Many parts of the galaxy are too rich in radiation or too poor in the kinds of metals that are needed to form planets or to form the various elements that are needed for life. So you need to have a place in the galaxy called the galactic habitable zone where life can exist. And so this is another fine-tuning parameter that's been, I think, deduced or inferred by ID proponents. So there's a lot of examples of this kind of thing. And again, I think this ID 3.0, we can talk about some of the specific projects if you guys want, but ID 3.0 is showing that ID can be applied in a variety of different fields.
I think that's a really powerful point that you're making there, because I imagine sometimes people think of intelligent design theorists as people who are sitting around looking at science and coming up with arguments for design and then publishing books. And I don't think that they think about the practical use of it. For example, in your debate with Adam Shapiro, it was really intriguing when you brought up that there are nanobots being made or designed that could potentially remove cancer and things like that. And I think I'm getting that right. So I just thought that was really encouraging for people to hear that this is not a bunch of eggheads sitting around impressing each other. This is something that has practical use in real life that can impact and improve our lives, which I think good science should. So I think you're making a really powerful point there.
Well, let me tell you, Chad, there are actually multiple books that I would like to be writing, but I don't have time. I do not have time to do it. I don't know when I'm going to find time to write some of these books because I am so busy managing our research. It's a great, I really am enjoying my job, to be honest with you guys right now, working with these people and helping people to just problem solve, troubleshoot, make sure they have the resources they need to do their research. So yeah, I mean, the one of the projects you just mentioned is building nanomachines, or they're really nano drills that can kill cancer cells. They can kill antibiotic resistant bacteria and also viruses. And this research has implications for the obstacles to evolving the first cell. And the reason why is, what does it take to build a machine? Well, this research is showing that to build a molecular microscopic machine requires intelligence, and a lot of it, by the way. These little machines are very difficult to produce. And research from this project has been published in journals like Nature, American Chemical Society, Nano, ACS Nano, ACS Applied Materials and Interfaces, and Nature Nanotechnology. And what these nano drills can do, basically, you can give them the ability to recognize certain tags that are on certain cell types, whether it's a cancer cell, maybe a bacterial type of cell, or maybe even a virus. And they can find their way to those cells, and then you can activate them, and they can bore a hole in the cell membrane, and then basically all the contents of that cell leak out, and the cell is destroyed. And they have very high levels of basically killing off whatever their targeted cells are. And there's promises these might even be usable on viruses. Obviously, the implications and applications there are obvious. So I think this is a very exciting project. We've been very happy to fund it. And it's been a project that shows how intelligent design reasoning, how can we design machines? Where do we get machines from? It requires intelligence. Using ID principles can actually help us solve real problems in biology, like antibiotic resistance.
Yes. Shifting gears here a little bit, I've noticed a bit of an increase in Christians that hold to a type of theistic evolution model of creation. Of course, biologos, probably most well known. I do realize that some ID theorists would be in the theistic evolution camp to a degree. However, you and Dr. Meyer and some other people have been somewhat critical of that view. And I was just curious as to what are some of your concerns with theistic evolution? Yeah,
so to understand what our concerns about theistic evolution are, we first have to define theistic evolution. And theistic evolution means very different things to many different people, okay? Now, we have to first define the word evolution. The word evolution can have multiple definitions, even within the scientific literature. So, for example, it can mean simple change over time or small-scale changes within a species. Well, nobody, whether inside or outside of the ID movement or whatever, I don't know of a single scientist of any background on this topic who disputes evolution when we define it as small scale change or change within a species or change over time. Everybody agrees that evolution does happen in that respect. Another way of defining evolution could be common ancestry, the idea that all living organisms are related. But even that definition of evolution leaves open the possibility of design. I mean, you could have a form of guided common descent where, sure, maybe one type of organism is descended from another, but in the interim, there was information that was infused into that biological lineage that radically changed it. And I was actually talking this morning to Gunter Beckley, who's an ID-friendly paleontologist, and he basically holds to sort of a form of guided common descent. It's not common descent in the sense of, this is just all unguided, material mechanisms connecting you to your dog or your cat or bacterium. There's been huge amounts of intervention in the history of life and intelligent cause that has intervened in the history of life amidst that descent. And then, of course, the final definition of evolution that we often see is that the driving mechanism of that change or that descent is natural selection acting upon random mutation. Of course, there are other forces like genetic drift and other standard evolutionary mechanisms, but that the driving mechanisms are sort of these apparently unguided processes like selection, like mutation, or other things like genetic drift, okay? So if you say you're a theistic evolutionist, the first question I ask you is, well, what do you mean by evolution? Because, well, I believe in a creator, and I believe that species can change over time and in a small extent. Does that make me a theistic evolutionist? Michael Behe accepts common ancestry, but he's a proponent of intelligent design. And one of the key tenets, when you really dig into a lot of the theistic evolution literature, like Francis Collins's book, or other theistic evolutionists, leading folks like Ken Miller, or a lot of the arguments, frankly, from BioLogos, well, they have been heavily critical of Michael Behe's arguments from irreducible complexity. Okay, so they do not like arguments that we can actually detect design in nature, even if you accept common ancestry. These theistic evolutionists, many of the folks in the BioLogos camp, are very critical of Michael Behe's arguments. So I don't really think that they've come up with very good rebuttals to Michael Behe's arguments, but the point is that I think that by and large, the leading theistic evolution organizations really do reject some of the foundational arguments of intelligent design, namely that there is information and complexity in nature which cannot be produced by an unguided natural cause, but is instead best explained by an intelligent cause, okay? You're not going to have your garden variety theistic evolutionist at BioLogos and many of these leading theistic evolution groups, Faraday Institute, they are not going to agree with that statement that we can actually scientifically detect design. And they're going to disagree stridently with Michael Behe on that point. So, so I don't think that a lot of folks in the ID movement will identify as a theistic evolutionist. So what are some of my concerns about theistic evolution? Well, first of all, I think it often does not engage it's not fully and highly engaged with the actual evidence. One of the questions that they love to ask is, well, could God have guided the evolutionary process to make life? And I often find that any question that begins with the words, could God? Usually the answer is yes. And usually it's really not a very interesting question, okay? I mean, God can do whatever he wants, all right? If God wants to use evolutionary mechanisms to create life, he can do that. Now, theistic evolution does pose some potential philosophical conundrums. The Darwinian model of evolution, I mean, I've got walls of biology textbooks in my office at Discovery Institute, and many of them have defined Darwinian evolution as an unguided process. So if you're taking the standard evolutionary view and you're a theistic evolutionist, you're saying that somehow God guided an unguided process. Now, whether there's a way to make sense of that in terms of divine providence, divine action, it gets into all kinds of deep philosophical and theological questions. It's not for me to say, all right? But I will say this, that if the evidence doesn't look like it was the product of an unguided process, then we don't have to waste time trying to figure out how God could guide an apparently unguided process, all right? So if the evidence doesn't look like life is the result of a Darwinian material process, and it actually looks like there's evidence of design in nature, then why should we wait? We don't have to worry about wasting time trying to reconcile theism with a view that frankly is very difficult to reconcile. So I like to approach it from a scientific standpoint and say, look, what does the evidence say? If the evidence does not say that life is the result of an apparently unguided process, I mean, even Francis Collins in his book, The Language of God, says that if the standard evolutionary view is true, which he argues in his book that it is true, he says that the history of life would have at least appeared to have been unguided. Okay, he says this in his book. And I find that very interesting because, Richard Dawkins famously said that biology is the study of complicated things that have the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So Dawkins, of course, thinks that it looks designed, but it really wasn't, right? Then we have these theistic evolutionists coming along saying that it doesn't look designed, but it really was. It's like we have Stockholm syndrome to our atheist captors where we want to, just agree with their conclusions that life wasn't designed when they're saying themselves that life looks like it was designed. I mean, it's just, we're getting into kind of like a surreal world here. So my argument is, look, what does the data say? The data is, in my opinion, strongly pointing to intelligent design. BioLogos and the theistic evolution crowd have come up with so many attempts to knock down our ID arguments over the years, and they have not succeeded. They have not been able to show that you can produce this new high CSI through unguided, apparently unguided evolutionary mechanisms. I think that ID arguments are still standing very strong. And so where does this leave us? Okay, let's shift back into the implication mode. All right, well, in the book of Romans, Paul says that that God is, quote unquote, clearly seen in what has been made. Okay, so let's now ask, what is most consistent with that verse? A scientific model which says that we can find evidence for design in nature, or Francis Collins's view, where if we replay the history of life, it would at least appear to us as if it had been unguided. I mean, he uses the word unguided. That's the exact word he uses. Okay, so if the history of life appears to be unguided, to me, that's kind of the exact opposite of when Paul says in Romans 1 that God is, quote unquote, clearly seen in nature. God is not, quote unquote, clearly seen if you're claiming that the evidence shows that it looks like it was unguided. It's the opposite of that. So I think there's a real tension between Romans 1 and what a lot of theistic evolutionists say. In fact, there was an article at BioLogos. They published an article once that said, and this is not a direct quote, but it's a pretty close quote, that their view of evolutionary creationism is what they often like to call their view. And it says evolutionary creationism does not have very much apologetic value. And I read this, I was like, oh my gosh, like you're actually admitting this. Okay. That like there is very little apologetic value to what they're doing. I do think actually that, I think that they need to be a little bit more generous to themselves. I think that there are some folks who are already Christians who find that a BioLogos evolutionary creationist view kind of helps them find a way. If they're already committed evolutionists and they're sure that that's what they want to be, then BioLogos and the theistic evolutionary creationism camp is there to try to give you a way to make sense of it. Okay. And I'm not here to deny that to people, but I do not hear very many stories of atheists being converted by a model that admits it has very little apologetic value. Okay. I mean, I don't see them giving atheists very many reasons to change their minds. Instead, what they've basically done is they've taken the standard evolutionary model of how life arose and they've just sort of baptized and said, by the way, this is how God did it. You won't find any specific evidence for that in nature. It's just a faith-based position that we hold for purely sort of, almost like fideistic blind faith reasons that God is the designer behind it all. And, that's fine. Like there's a lot of things and I don't believe that faith is necessarily blind, but there are many things in our Christian faith, our Christian walk that we just sort of do accept because we trust God, and we don't always have evidence for everything in the way that we'd like. But I think that in the case of God's existence, we as Christians have reason to suspect that we should actually see evidence because Paul says that he is, quote unquote, clearly seen in nature. So something is off there with theistic evolution. Okay. Something is way off because as Christians, we should be expecting to find evidence for God in nature, yet they're telling us that we don't. And they're telling us instead that the history of life appears to be unguided. They're telling us that when our atheist friends tell us that life appears to be designed, but it really isn't, that actually life doesn't appear to be designed, but it really was. And I just find some huge disconnects there. So we could go on and on about this, but that's sort of my take on theistic evolution. But I primarily approach it from the evidence. It's just not supported by the evidence. If the history of life does not seem to be a fully unguided show, then why should we waste our time trying to reconcile our faith with that kind of a perspective?
Yeah, very good. One more question I have here is, seeing that you're right in the thick of the ID movement and know every sort of research project going on, it seems, I wonder what you found to be maybe the most powerful arguments, or maybe even ones that you've seen people maybe change their mind after being exposed to certain ID arguments.
Yeah, so I do think that some of the research that we've done that I discussed earlier about the origin of proteins is really sort of the bread and butter ID arguments, that these are arguments that show that really the basic predictions going back to the earliest days of ID are true, that there is so much information in living systems that they cannot evolve by a step-by-step process, and yet they contain an information-rich, complex and specified information-rich, language-based code that, in our experience, only comes from intelligence. So when we talk about Doug Axe's research, finding high levels of complex and specified information, I know a lot of folks who, when they saw that evidence, it was published in the Journal of Molecular Biology, by the way, when they saw some of Doug's research in those papers, they felt like, wow, this is really compelling evidence, and ID is really up to something real here. Another project that I think has excited a lot of the scientists within the ID community, and that I'm very excited about, is something called the Engineering Research Group. And I did not talk about this in the Adam Shapiro debate, so I can talk about it here maybe for the first time. At least other people have talked about this, but I don't think I have. We have a large consortium of over 50 biologists and engineers who are trying to apply principles from systems biology to see if we can better understand biology when it is looked at from an engineering lens. We sponsored a conference last year where about 40 to 50 biologists and engineers gathered to together try to make better sense of biology from an engineering standpoint. And they're finding that when we assume that biological systems are actually designed and are not, again, they're not just these kludges that were cobbled together haphazardly, that engineers and biologists can actually work together to make progress through essentially what is called systems biology, where we assume that, parts are there for a reason. These systems communicate with each other, they interact, they interface. A living cell, a living organism, a living being is an integrated whole. And these are not just parts that have sort of just, through an unguided process, just happen to find some way that they can, barely connect with each other. No, organisms are highly fine-tuned, optimized systems, which have a lot of interconnectivity. And so last year, there's a PhD engineer involved with this project who published a 3-part series of papers where he analyzed the bacterial flagellum and chemotaxis, which is a mechanism by which bacteria are able to target food and swim towards food. And he looked at it from an engineering standpoint, and he asked what would be needed engineering-wise to create a food-finding system for bacteria. And he went through many available options and ways to engineer the system and found that the best options basically are what we do find in nature. Something like a bacterial flagellum, an outboard motor on bacteria with an integrated system into the bacterial cell that works with other subsystems, sensors basically, that are then sending signals to a central processing unit that then sends signals out to the bacteria to tell it where to swim, how to redirect itself using the flagellum as its propeller to find food. I mean, you think of a bacterium being just a simple cell. Heck no, they are highly sophisticated systems. Or another project coming out of this is looking at the cell as sort of an embedded computing system, and where it has information processing, primary memory, secondary memory, memory addressing, low-level memory layout, memory management, a cache, timers, RAM, data formatting, and many other things. So there are many projects that are coming out of this engineering research group that I think are very exciting, and they're showing that really, when you view life as engineered, it makes more sense. We can make better sense of it, and I think there's a lot more to come from this engineering research group. So I wanted to say that if any folks want to get involved with the engineering research group, go to Discovery Institute website, contact us, and we'll get you plugged in.
Excellent. I just have one more question for you, Casey. I know you can only go into so much detail on this, but during your discussion with Mr. Shapiro on Unbelievable, you shared that there are many prominent scientists that are kind of coming out of the woodwork in support of ID. And could you just describe that as much as you can, just because I personally found it encouraging, and I think some of our listeners would as well.
Well, so first off, I'm just going to give you guys a fact. I can't prove this to you, but this is the life I live. On a weekly basis, we have scientists coming out of the woodwork, contacting us at Discovery Institute and wanting to get involved with intelligent design. I try to leave no scientist behind. And so I try to always make sure that when someone reaches out an email, that we do a Zoom with these people. So Brian Miller and I, the two of us often tag team, Zooming with scientists who are, finding us. So sometimes these are PhD students. A couple months ago, we had a wonderful conversation with a PhD student in systems biology who thinks that ID is the way to go to make sense of biology. In the last couple weeks, we've had conversations with 2 biology postdocs that we've just recently met at, I won't say where, but let's just say top schools. I mean, like top schools in the country who are interested in intelligent design and want to work with us at Discovery Institute even, So this happens all the time. So the idea that there's only a handful of scientists that support intelligent design is really not true. The vast majority of these folks are early in their careers. I mean, these two postdocs that we spoke with recently, and then that PhD student, we talked to tenured faculty as well. In fact, last week it was the week before last, I talked to a tenured biology professor at a public university, we'll just say in the Western United States. And he actually teaches his students about the debate over intelligent design, gives them an assignment where they're able to weigh the evidence for evolution and intelligent design and explore it however they want. They can come to whatever conclusion they want. They just have to support it with evidence. This is a tenured biology professor who just reached out to us a few weeks ago. He is tenured, so he can actually be openly doing this. He doesn't have to worry about losing his job. But this PhD student, the two postdocs we recently talked to, these guys are in a very different position. If they were to talk publicly about their views on intelligent design, it would get them into a lot of trouble. So we certainly advise them to keep their heads down, to lay low, and to wait until they're in a secure faculty kind of tenured position before they do that. So the point is that there are a lot of folks out there who are sympathetic to intelligent design, but they really are not able to talk about their views. So what is like the most secure that you could get in your career? If you are intelligent design, if you wanted to talk about your views on intelligent design, well, I would say being a Nobel Prize winner is pretty secure. We've actually had a couple Nobel Prize winners who have endorsed intelligent design. Last year, Nobel laureate at Cambridge University, a physicist named Brian Josephson, endorsed Steve Meyer's book, Return to the God Hypothesis. And in the endorsement, he said, far from being an unscientific claim, intelligent design is valid science. Another Nobel Prize winning physicist named Charles Towns, who was at UC Berkeley, he passed away in 2015. But before he passed away, he said, intelligent design, as one sees it from a scientific point of view, seems to be quite real. This is a special universe. It's remarkable that it came out this way. If the laws of physics were not just the way they are, we couldn't be here at all. So there's a pretty strong endorsement from another Nobel Prize winner.
Yeah.
There are 3 Nobel Prize winners who endorsed a book by Marcos Eberlin that Discovery Institute Press published a few years ago titled Foresight. Marcos Eberlin is one of the most prominent chemists in Brazil and a member of the Brazilian National Academy of Sciences, where he's widely recognized for his work on mass spectrometry. And he's a high-level convert to intelligent design. And again, his book got endorsements from 3 Nobel Prize winners. I don't know exactly where all of them stand on. One of them was Brian Josephson. I don't know exactly where they all stand on ID, but if they're willing to endorse a book arguing for intelligent design, clearly they don't think that he's crazy and that these ideas are crazy.
Yeah, right.
But I think, one of our favorite examples of a high-level convert, because we work so closely with him, is Günter Beckley. Günter is an Austrian paleontologist and entomologist who specializes in insects and dragonfly fossils in particular. And he first came out as a Darwin skeptic and ID sympathizer in 2015. But his story is really interesting. He was a curator at the State Museum of Natural History in Stuttgart, Germany. And in 2009, he was asked to organize their Darwin Day event for the bicentennial of Darwin's birth. I don't know if folks may or may not remember this, but in 2009, there was a lot of conversation, a lot of talk about the fact that it was 200 years since Darwin was born and 150 years since he published Origin of Species. So a lot of big Darwin Day events. Darwin Day is February 12th. That's Darwin's birthday. So Günter wanted to create an exhibit at his museum to show how strong the evidence was in favor of Darwin's theory. And in order to do this, he decided to read some of the books of Darwin's critics, Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box, etc., other books. He was expecting to find that the evidence was overwhelmingly against intelligent design and that there was no argument, against evolution that was valid. Instead, he found that really the criticisms of Behe's work did not hold water. And there was something there, and that these arguments for intelligent design were actually much stronger than he was expecting. He became convinced sort of privately that intelligent design was correct. And when he finally sort of came public, I think it was in 2015, he immediately faced persecution at his museum. He kind of became persona non grata. But, their loss was our gain because Günter now works with us here at Discovery Institute. Prior to his coming out as an ID proponent, he had a Wikipedia page about his many scientific accomplishments. But after being canceled by his museum, Wikipedia then canceled him and tried to erase him from history.
Wow.
And his Wikipedia page is now gone. So, but Günter is a very credible scientist, a PhD in geosciences. And he's one of the leaders of our Waiting Times project, one of the research projects we're funding, which is basically looking at the fossil record and saying, okay, we know that from the fossil record, there's certain time brackets where certain features could not have existed at time A, yet they did exist later at time B. And then they asked the question, well, what are some of the genetic requirements to produce these features? And then given known population genetics factors like, the population size or the generation time or the mutation rate, is there enough time for these traits to evolve given the amount of time that's available during what we know from the fossil record? And they published an article in the Journal of Theoretical Biology last year where they laid out a population genetics mathematical model that they can then use to ask these questions. And they're now actively applying this model to apply it to other systems. So this is a really exciting research project we're funding that Gunter is one of the leaders on. And we're looking forward to seeing them basically test the evolvability of various features that appear in the fossil record abruptly and asking whether Darwinian evolution can be the answer for those systems.
Wow. Thank you.
We've talked about the tip of the iceberg. I mean, the scientists that we've talked about really are the tip of the iceberg. We have now over 600 students that have graduated from our summer seminar every July in intelligent design. Many of these people are now going on to become, they're either getting their PhDs or they're now postdocs or they're young faculty that are friendly to intelligent design. Quite a few of the alumni of our program are already contributing to ID research. And if folks want to get involved with this, come to our summer seminar. You can find it online. This summer seminar for July 2022, it's already pretty much filled because it's happening in just a couple months. We just did the admissions over the last couple weeks, but come to our summer seminar. You'll get to learn a lot more about ID research, get to meet the folks who are doing it, and you can get involved.
Super.
Very encouraging.
Casey, we really appreciate your time. And of course, like we said, all of your work. We want to point people to the resources that you mentioned there. Where's the best go-to place where they can kind of find everything? Would that be discovery.org? Yeah, discovery.org is sort of our homepage. We have a lot of different programs at discovery.org. So if you go to, you can click on the intelligent design link at the top of the page and you'll see how to get all the information on ID. But really our main website where we put out information about intelligent design and evolution is evolutionnews.org. And from there, you can get daily articles on evolution and intelligent design. And you guys have a great podcast. If it's okay to mention our podcast as well.
Sure.
It's
absolutely.
Okay, thanks. It's ID the Future. You can go to idthefuture.com to get our podcast and a lot of great resources there too. Super. Casey, thanks so much for being with us. We very much appreciate it. Great to talk to you guys, and thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. And please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.